the most liberating force or factor. Because it's the thing we all run away from.
Yeah.
The fact that none of us gets out of here alive. The fact that we're all going to die. I've beaten the rap.
This week's guest on Ireland Unfiltered is Tommie Gorman. Before we go to that interview, don't forget to subscribe on all the usual channels to the show, and if you like the show, please leave a review. This interview was an extraordinary insight into one of the best known journalists in Ireland, but a journalist who does things his way. It was fascinating listening to Tommie talk about the people he knows in Northern Ireland, the politicians he's got to know. Boris Johnson, who he knew first in Brussels when they were both EU correspondents, and how he has coped with the illness that he was diagnosed with in 1994 and he has lived with since. He is an extraordinary man. Tommie, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
It's
lovely
really,
to be here.
It's great to have you here. Just looking at you today and watching your charisma and your charm as you've come in today, I was initially going to ask you, because what I've heard from people talking about you this week is that people trust you. And I was going to ask you, do people always trust you? But now I see I can see how you could charm people too. Were you always able to get people's trust?
I don't know. I think you have to try and make people feel comfortable in your company. You have to try and be comfortable in theirs. I've been really lucky along the way that, some of the people that you just see how they carry themselves. And I think the best people are classless because sometimes the greatest lessons you can get are from people who behave in a certain way. There's a man called Sean Fallon. He was the assistant manager of Celtic under Jock Stein, and he came from Sligo, and he's such an interesting fella. You could nearly take an hour to talk about him, but let me just tell you what I saw in him and what I admired in him. He was from the working classes in Sligo. His father was a Fine Gael councillor, and Sean worked in a bakery, but he was a great athlete. So he was a great Gaelic player, and he was a great soccer player, and he really looked after himself. So before he'd start work in the bakery in the morning, he used to run out to the Holy Well in Sligo to get himself fit. So anyway, he made his career. He went to Glasgow Celtic and he became known as the Iron Man because one time he played with a broken limb. He captained Celtic. He went on to manage them. But I suppose what was outstanding about him for me were the values that he had. And there he was with Jock Stein. He was the assistant manager. But there was a young fellow coming up who wanted to try and learn the trade, and that was Alex Ferguson. And Alex Ferguson said, Sean Fallon would tell me more than Jock Stein. He'd share more with me. So anyway, life moved on. Celtic won the European Cup in, 67. Sean was with them then. He had a stint at managing. That didn't work out brilliantly. He went and he managed another club. But he always kept up his links with Sligo. And towards the end of his life, he had won these Irish caps, but he had never been presented with the caps. The FAI even then was doing it on the cheap. So they gave him a sort of a job lot, one for every 6 caps,
Yeah.
So he was due a few caps, and he was coming to the end of his life, and he wanted to have the caps to pass on to his grandchildren. So we got him the caps in Sligo, and I went over to present them to him. And he said to me about his life, Dion, he said, if you can get on with people, you chat away to them. And if there's any tension in your relationship with them, or if you feel they don't like you or whatever, you just avoid them and you just keep out of their way. And it really, really struck me as just a lovely, lovely way to live your life, that if you can, you're better off getting on with people, but if there's going to be trouble between you, well, just keep out of their way. So anyway, I did an interview with them a few, that time that I went over with the Caps, and a few days later he died suddenly. And who came to give the eulogy at his funeral? Alex Ferguson. And guys from Rangers came to the funeral. Ali McCoist was at his funeral. And of course lots of Celtic, all the greats of Celtic were there, the old guys. But a fascinating thing about him for me as well was Fallon was a son of a Fine Gael councillor who had fought in the First World War.
Right.
He went on to become the manager of Celtic. And in this city of Celtic and Rangers, where you had orange and green tensions, here was this guy whose history went back to the First World War, whose father fought in the British Army. And I think some of that complexity gave him his grace and his wisdom. And I also thought it was fascinating that even though Alex Ferguson was manager of United at the time, and I think they were going off to Dubai or somewhere on a break, he stayed behind to give the eulogy at his funeral. And he called me aside in the graveyard and he says, what was he chatting about, when you were with him? Because you were one of the last people to see him. So he was such an influential person and such a great guy as Ferguson, you know.
But where did your curiosity about people come from? Like, did it come from your parents? Did they have that?
We're a very tight family. There were 4 of us in it. My sister died suddenly 3 years ago, my baby sister, so we're down to 3 now. But we had days when we were very wealthy. My father was a cattle dealer, and then it all disappeared. So then we had days when, money was really tight.
What do you mean it all disappeared?
Well, the cattle business was tricky, and if you trusted people, as my father did, it was a dangerous kind of a thing to do. Your word was your bond. So cattle business was changing as well, in that the marts were coming and the fairs were going, and my father and his father before him were from the fairs. But they were known as very honest people, and I think decent was the word that was used about them. But he got TB, and he was drinking for a while. So I think the combination of illness and drink and poor judgments, poor friends, it just meant that it all disappeared. So my brother was around and my older sister, they were around for the good times. It was sort of a changing environment as I was growing up. So then his body was pretty wrecked by TB, but he survived it, which was wonderful. So then we just grew up a very tight family.
In Sligo town at this stage?
We just really, you had to bind tight together. My granny lived with us.
Okay.
She came to live with us when I was born, and she was from Leitrim, and she never left. So she had great spirit. She lived to 101, but we just stuck really tight together. So we looked like sort of middle class people because of where we lived. We lived in a semi-detached house. We had my father bought the house, I think, because it had a corporate box looking out on Markievicz Park. I didn't realise it until he was dead, but I didn't realise what a child in him, like in me.
Yeah.
But we had this wonderful view out our front window of Markievicz Park, our upstairs window.
But you were a football man.
Well, we grew up there opposite the Markievicz Park, and all through the years, it was just our parents were utterly selfless. Nothing was hidden, everything was talked about, but it was really straight. And the affection was never any complication or twist in the affection. It was just straightforward love.
Okay, that's a bit unusual for the time, was it, would you think?
Well, I suppose it was what was required just to get through life, that you understood the importance of affection and of being there for each other.
Yeah.
So he had a variety of jobs. He worked as a tyre salesman. He worked for Gilby's, and his last job was as a petrol pump attendant.
Okay.
Because his health was going, and then just to pay the bills and make sure we got through, my mother was a nurse's aide at night, and she'd sort of maybe come off work and then be there for us for breakfast time and so on. So it was absolutely love without conditions from them. So I suppose that's what I grew up in. And
that's what you look back. Do you look back on it with, like, was it tough as well? It must have been tough.
No. But I suppose you didn't want to have to struggle as much yourself. You sort of saw the dignity of struggle, but also the tension that it creates in a life, or the pressure, not the tension, but the pressure it creates in a life. So I suppose I was very, very conscious of that growing up. But also, the lovely thing about it was there was never anything hidden. There was a real closeness in us. And, you know, I've tried to continue on with the same kind of values myself with my own kids, my own wife.
And do you feel that's something that you do carry on, and it's a central thing to raising a family?
I think it's absolutely vital. That, you know, that love is expressed, that it's not hidden.
And journalism then, when did you, I saw you described your primary school teachers as kind of magicians, like they were able to create this sort of wondrous land for you, or these wondrous ideas for you. Like, how much was education and a part of planting the seed for journalism in you?
I was lucky in that my older brother Michael is a much better writer than I am, and he sort of encouraged that in me. You know, he'd sometimes help me with script for debates and things like that. And he was always getting the Sunday Times. And then we had an uncle, a priest, who came home one time, and he got us a subscription to Time magazine. So there was always an interest in the word, and there was always an interest in sport. And I was really lucky in school. Schools were great. I was taught by nuns in Scoil Fatima. I was taught by Mars Brothers School in the second part of National School. And then I went to Summerhill, and Summerhill was fantastic because I was so lucky. I got in just after the brutal period, you know, when corporal punishment was gone, when Donogh O'Malley's third level education just made access available for everybody, and where, you know, Summerhill had been a pretty brutal place at certain periods of my brother's time, in fact. But when I came, the windows were thrown open, the light was let in. It was, there's no such thing as a bad boy. And in that atmosphere, I was really encouraged. So I suppose, I was interested in English, I was interested in history. And I had one really, really great teacher who trained the football team and had me as his bagman. He was an English teacher. And he was the one who said to me, you should really think about journalism. So I wasn't sure in secondary school whether I wanted to do medicine or to do journalism. So it became journalism. And
then you went to Rathmines.
Yeah. I went to the College of Journalism, and there were 16 of us in the class, 4 guys, 12 women. And it was an amazing course. It was 2 years. And at that stage, I started doing bits for the Sligo Champion sport, Sligo Rovers away games, because getting stuff published was kind of important. And then at the end of your first year, you had to get a placement. So I went home. I went to the Champion for the summer. That was 1976. And then you were back for your second year, and the clock was ticking. And it was just a 2-year course. It was amazing, you know. So at the end of the second year, I suppose there's a fair element of importance of this in my life. I was offered a job in a new newspaper, kind of an operation like JOE.ie, ducking and diving, pushing out the barriers. And it was down in Ballina. John Healy and Jim Maguire who were the guys who were starting it. And the choice was, do your final exams or take the job.
Right.
So I took the job. And then I went down and I discovered that I hadn't been hired. I was being paid lineage. So for every line you wrote, you got 2p or whatever.
Right.
So there I was. No finals, no job, this sort of dodgy enough contract. So I had to write my head off to make it cheaper for them.
Yeah.
So that was June 77. Then the repeats came up in September 1977. And the choice at that stage was do the repeats or cover Sligo Rovers versus Red Star Belgrade in Tito's Yugoslavia,
Right.
and sell the ads to pay for the trip and take the photographs and break all the NUJ rules.
Yeah.
So I made the only choice that could be made.
As a Sligo Rovers man.
Yeah. So I never did the final exams. I never got the stripe.
But you were in Belgrade.
I was in Belgrade. So again, that operation, that Western Journal, I was there for 3 years, and I ended up as the managing editor of it. And to this day, 39 years later, I'm still pleasantly amused when a cheque comes every fortnight, because having worked in what was a ducking and diving operation where you'd be looking at the tot to see how much advertising was in, and you'd be writing the cheques, wondering did we have the money to meet it. It's just an amazing relief to be working in a place that's kind of financially solid, like RTE.
Yeah. And John Healy, he said when he hired you, he said you came from snipe grass. Was that it? Was that the expression he used?
Healy was wonderful. His phrases never leave you.
Yeah.
Watch the clock in the morning, forget about it at night.
Yeah.
He had one great, I remember he set me one test. He said he damaged his nose when he was playing football in goals for Charlestown, so he used to snort. But he said one time, kid, if you're not able to claim a week's wages when you sign your name to the Our Father at the age of 45, you haven't succeeded.
Right.
That was Healy's view.
Yeah.
By the time you reach 45, you should be able to just sign your name to the Our Father and claim a week's wages.
Okay.
Healy was he was amazing.
So he meant your reputation alone should get you.
He meant you should be able to.
Right.
You should know enough at that stage,
Right.
and you should have enough, I suppose, weight behind you.
Right.
But when he was interviewing me like this, he noticed that there was a patch in my trousers.
Yeah.
And it was very neatly darned. And he said to me, who fixed the patch in your trousers, kid? So I said, my grandmother.
Yeah.
So he says, you come from Snipegrass. By that he meant that, you'd be hungry.
Yeah.
And that's what he wanted.
Yeah.
He says, if you haven't got hunger, he also used to say, if you haven't got a guardian angel, if you haven't got someone looking out for you, if you don't have luck in journalism, well, you're finished. If you don't have luck in life, you're finished.
And what do you think of the prospects for people these days going into journalism?
Well, I have one son, Joe.
Yeah, we know.
You know him, he was here with you.
Yeah.
And he'd be better in this chair than me. And I have tried to warn him to stay away from it.
Right.
Because I just worry about the future of the trade.
Yeah.
I look at the type of contracts people are getting. I look at the sales of newspapers. I look at the habits in terms of watching television. And it's a lot tougher. Indeed, in general, it's one of the things I really, really regret, that the world we're passing on to Joe's generation is not as kind a world as the one that I arrived into when I was his age.
Do you think that?
I'm convinced.
In what way?
I think it's really, really tough for kids coming out. I think we're not giving them the space, the opportunities. I think they have to live with. I'd love to get inside their heads and see how maybe they see it completely differently. But like when I was coming out, you know, there were jobs in banks, there were jobs in the civil service. There were so many opportunities. Everybody got a job. When I was coming out, the EU money was coming into regional colleges, as they were called then, and everybody got a grant. But I just look at kids nowadays, and when you come out with a primary degree, it's like having intercert, junior cert. Yeah. You've got to do so much more. And I think as well that even, say, or especially maybe in some of the, say, the professions like law, for instance, accountancy, they work the guts out of them in their late 20s, early 30s. They really, really use them as the wealth creators, use the kids. And I think it's really, really tough for them. And I think journalism is no different.
You went to RTE then as the Northwestern correspondent.
Yeah, 1980.
And was that a big deal at the time? Was that like? Did you feel like you'd made it?
I was working in Ballina, and you'd be on a Monday you'd be making up the paper in the setting room, and I liked the actual cutting and pasting and, you know, composition of front pages and so on. And only for my mother drove over from Sligo with the RTE application, I'd have missed it.
Right.
She came over and she knew there was a deadline on it. A few months beforehand, I had been interviewed for a radio programme that Bunny Carr was doing in Sligo. And when I just saw his ease within the studio and I saw the impact of it, I said, Jesus, this is a different medium, radio, television. Not the same, I suppose, buzz in terms of the written word, but it has huge impact. And I just saw that if you want to have impact, that maybe it was the medium. So I was really, really lucky because I had no experience in broadcasting, and I wasn't coming from Dublin, I was coming from the region. Yeah. So I was really, really lucky I got the job, and I think Healy gave me a good reference. But I remember there was a guy called Mike Burns who was an absolute legend in RTE, and I went into him, and he was across the other side of the table, and of course you're so goddamn nervous. So he said to me, "Yeah, you came up from Sligo," and I said, "Yeah." He says, "The sun was in your eyes," and I said, "Yeah, and it'll be in your eyes on the way home." I said, "Yeah." And he set me at ease just by that warmth. Right. He was from Roscommon. Yeah. So like when I got the job, I was just amazed.
But how much did you, when you say you're coming from a print background, how much did you have to learn then about, how different was it?
Oh, it was completely different skill. Yeah. Like having to learn about pictures and writing to pictures. I remember the first radio piece I was doing, I must have spent an hour trying to put down 45 seconds because I kept stumbling and making mistakes. And the Jack O'Brien was the sound operator, and he was just so nice. And I thought, I'm never going to crack this. And then to learn, like, television is such a completely different medium. And I was lucky in a way that I didn't have a camera crew based in Sligo at the time, or in the Northwest. So it was a while before I got, say, the colleagues where there'd be an expectation for you to produce material. Okay. But it was a completely different world.
But is the background you have and your love of the written word, like the turn of phrase you would have, and when you're broadcasting, is that something you could trace back to that love of the written word?
Well, when you're doing television, there's no point in having a wonderful script if you haven't got the pictures that complement it. So pictures sometimes tell the story for you, and you just have to get the words to go along with the pictures. Like, pictures drive television. Radio is different in some respects, but there is that space where you can maybe combine a particular phrase to go along with the pictures, and I suppose that's when the magic can happen sometimes.
You went to Europe then in 1989.
Yeah, I remember I was doing the St. Patrick's Day parade script for the 7th year in a row.
Right.
And I said to myself, Jesus, there has to be something better than this. We used to have a competition in RTE to see who'd use the most cliches about a St. Patrick's Day script, you know.
So what were they? What were they?
You know, the best ever, and, you know, and Shamrock, you know, Shamrock was on display, or St. Patrick was whatever. But it was kind of soul destroying. Now, I loved the region, and there was an amazing mix in it, because you had Derry and Donegal, and you had Cavan Monaghan, as well as Sligo and Leitrim. So I loved that. But I was really lucky getting the break in Europe. Eamon Lawler was coming home to see if he wanted to make the transition to being a newscaster, to becoming a studio person. And it was for a year initially. And I think one of the reasons that they gave it to me was because Ray McSharry was the Agriculture Commissioner. Right. And he was, you know, hard to get a story out of. You know, he was cautious. And because I knew him from Sligo, they thought maybe, you know, Gorman might be able to get something out of him.
Right. And so that's why you got
it was one of the reasons, you know. I hope there were others too, but it was an interesting factor. And
were they right?
Oh, like seeing McSharry close up was amazing. Yeah. But it was a 1 year initially. It was to be for 1 year, but we stayed for 12. And it changed my life really in so many ways.
And talk to me about the people you encountered, and this might bring us back to the present day in certain ways, because one of the people who's also working as a European correspondent when you were in Brussels was Boris Johnson. And last year when he was in Dublin, he mentioned you, as he said that he said ask Tommie, was I ever a Euro enthusiast? He said.
Yeah, like you hunt in packs. Yeah. Sure, I met you on that circuit, and you know, Shawnee Flynn, Lord rest him, of the Irish Times, John Downing, Mark Hennessy, Paddy Smith, Conor Sweeney. There were some of the Irish. Catherine Butler, brilliant journalist. She's with the Guardian now, from Thurles. They were the Irish set. So we were really lucky because we were small in numbers, but we had access to, you know, the Irish officials, the Irish Commissioner. Now the Brits had a much bigger group because they're a bigger country and have more outlets. And Boris was part of that set. And he was working for the Telegraph. Yeah. And he was the bane of the lives of most of his colleagues, because he was always going to come with something from left field. There was always going to be some bent banana story or something wild. And just at the end of the evening, the fellas would think they had filed. And the next thing, they'd get a call from their news desks that Boris had a story on the front page of the Telegraph. And they'd say, but sure, that's daft. Yeah. But then they'd still have to go and file something because of the impact it would have. Yeah. I remember as well, like John Major was the Prime Minister at the time. And at each summit, there'd always be a question from Boris. And Major would be dreading it. Right. Because it would always be something tricky, off the wall, towards that Eurosceptic wing. But in those days, the Eurosceptics were in the minority. Yeah. And that's what's completely different now.
And was Boris, like, was it, you know, when you talk about the bendy bananas, which is one of the kind of ones that's gone down in legend as a classic bit of Euro kind of fiction that Boris sort of fed to the masses or to the Telegraph readers. But was it that sense of opportunism kind of clear and obvious in him at that stage?
Well,
and ambition.
Well, like he's a complex guy, and if he wasn't having such a serious impact, your first reaction to Boris would be to smile.
Yeah.
And I think that's the danger of Boris. That's his impact. But like, he was so well connected. His father had been a European Commission official. His wife was a daughter of Charles Wheeler, one of the finest BBC correspondents, an absolute legend in his trade. So like, he was mixing with very bright people, and he had an Oxford education himself. But he was so eccentric, Boris. And he'd usually turn up late, and he had a great sense of humour. And he'd sit in beside a fella, and he'd have missed maybe the first 20 minutes of the briefing, and his first question would be to a colleague, "Why is this bad for Britain?"
Right.
You know, that's... You know, so that would be his first principle.
That's the
starting
point.
from there. Yeah, so that was Boris.
By the time this goes out, he might be Prime Minister, so...
I saw him recently.
Did you?
Yeah. He was in Belfast. He was invited to the DUP's annual conference. Yeah. So I had a bit of banter, let's put it that way, with them behind the stage.
Did you?
Gorman, what are you doing here? You know, and I said, "Geez, what are you doing here?" You know, Boris winding people up. You know. So
anyway, they're uneasy bedfellows now, aren't they? The DUP and Boris, like, it's not.
Well, it's a tricky relationship, and I think they're maybe going to get more than they bargained for. I think there's going to be there might be an element of a sting in the tail from this Eurosceptic phase for the DUP.
What do you mean?
I mean that if you look at, say, what has happened over the last few years, you know, the worst Hollywood scriptwriter wouldn't suggest the combination of events like Martin McGuinness getting sick, Martin McGuinness dying, David Cameron calling, staging a referendum, David Cameron losing, the DUP taking the stance they did, the RHI emerging, power sharing collapsing, and then the DUP, where all of the, I suppose, authority and weight within their party was coming through Stormont, and Westminster was the afterthought. And suddenly, because of the election Theresa May called, the DUP find themselves in pole position in Westminster, while there's nothing going on back in Stormont. So the weight suddenly shifted completely, and the authority within the DUP. But where I say there might be a sting in the tail, like there's a chance now, like there's new history being created between our islands. This is a new space, and who knows where it's leading. But I think there's a chance that you'd have a hard Brexit.
Yeah.
And in those circumstances, the DUP could find themselves being blamed for that. And who knows where that will take us. Like, I'd agree with the analysis of Bertie Ahern, and sure, like, who would I be to dispute it, in that he was the one who helped to shape the Good Friday Agreement. And he said that this notion of a border poll, that the context in which that was anticipated was after X years of stable power sharing. He didn't see it coming where power sharing would have collapsed and where you'd have a scratchy relationship between orange and green. But, you know, that is a possibility now, Dion.
And that would seem to me, again, Seamus Mallon is talking about this as well as, you know, or going further than that even, and saying it's you know, the idea is you know, there needs to be a total change of emphasis before. Yeah, I heard that's, I haven't read the book yet, but I know Seamus Mallon and I so admire him. And I heard his interview with Marion Finucane.
And I heard him talking about that you need 40% of unionists and 40%. Now, that's the formula they use for the petition of concern in Stormont. That's the formula that has caused so much trouble. So I couldn't see that happening.
Yeah.
I couldn't see nationalists allowing that to happen. But I would also be very, very wary of the notion of a border poll anytime soon, because I don't think society north of the border, and I'd also have real issues about society, questions about society south of the border.
Well, that's something we've sort of has been a sort of theme of this series with various people we've had on, Jarlath Burns, different people talking about the change in atmosphere and the change in tension and the tensions that have come up through Brexit. And you talked about Bertie Ahern there. I know in the speech, like in Belfast last week, he said that it was the fear of unionists that got the least sympathy in this whole thing, and that some of the language from Dublin in speaking to unionists lacked the empathy we extended to nationalists. And if we're looking for a united Ireland, surely that has to be a basic, that we try and understand these people who we want to unite with.
Yeah. Would that it were as easy as that. They're different.
Yeah.
And I've really, really tried. I'm back working in Belfast since 2001. I've tried to get to understand, where they come from, what their views are, where their suspicions are. And sometimes I think of Catholics and Protestants. When we were young fellas, we'd go into confessions, tell the sins, and you'd come out happy days, slate clean, and ready for more action. Protestants, they don't have that. They carry it around. It's on the account. It's on the slate. Yeah. It'll be checked on Judgment Day. And sometimes they look at these characters who are walking out of the church. Happy days, here we go again, new fun, rubbing the hands. Yeah. And that's just...
Brand new day.
Brand new day. So maybe that's just one very, very simplistic example of the difference. But there are so many things about life as it is that infuriate them. Like, say, for instance, at the moment, a very good example is the sensitivity over the prosecution of soldiers and police officers who, if they have broken the law, they deserve to be held to account. But unionists, Protestants, loyalists, they're looking at Republicans who operated by different rules, who never tell, and society will never be able to put the squeeze on them to tell what who did what, because they say, well, that doesn't apply to us. But at the same time, the state itself has been held to account. Yeah. So that's a very real tension in the society, and that's not going to change. And Bertie Ahern is right when he talks about there being a requirement to try to understand where the different people are coming from with these arguments.
But it's harder, because one of the things when you talk about the sting in the tail for them, one of the things that would seem to be part of that siege mentality is this fear, which is probably real, that at any given the opportunity, Britain, the establishment in Britain will ditch them. Like they're not considered as British by people in Britain as unionists like to consider themselves.
That's right. In many respects, they are a lost tribe. And if they're looking at, say, the medium-term future, the Scots could leave. A lot of them have roots in Scotland. So that's the place across the water where some of them go on holidays, where their kids attend university. Yeah. And I often saw it in Brussels, that when the Scots or the Welsh or the Northern Irish were attending a council and the minister was from Westminster, often they got more information from the likes of Joe Walsh when he was Agriculture Minister or Ivan Yates when he was Agriculture Minister than they might get from their own Agriculture Minister. So it must be a very unsettling relationship for them. And then, say, for instance, when they see Prince Charles coming and the friendship he has, and the way he likes to come down south as well as go up north, and they must wonder there what's going on as well. And then say the mild, and there are lots of mild, very, very fair-minded unionists, and when they're looking at what are the implications of Brexit for us, like the numbers of them getting Irish passports, the numbers of them who want their kids to go on Erasmus schemes, the numbers of them who are looking at the cross-border directive in healthcare. And there must be grounds for insecurity in that arrangement.
And yet the backstop, which we see here as an essential and a necessity, is seen differently by them and is seen as a threat to their integrity as part of the union.
One of the hardest things to do in real time or soon after is to acknowledge might have made a bit of a mistake here. I was around the DUP thinking at the time of the Brexit referendum, and many of their key people were convinced we'll fly the flag on this one, but it's going to be a victory for the Remain camp.
Yeah.
So they felt they could protect their backs from, say, the more extreme sides. They could be true to their Eurosceptic credentials. And then it would swiftly pass and they could get back to power sharing with Sinn Féin and working on that very difficult relationship. And when the result came, like sometimes I go back and I look at the pictures of the numbers of them who were there present on the night of the referendum result. And it wasn't a huge party.
Right.
Yeah. It wasn't something that they saw as being earth-shattering, game-changing. They didn't really anticipate it coming. And I'd say if Cameron's life was destroyed by it, Theresa May's career is being destroyed by it. Like, it's a monster at the moment that's eating up careers.
An advisor of May's says that when she got the job, she thought it would take up 10% of her time.
Yeah.
When she became Prime Minister, she thought Brexit would take up her Fridays.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been watching, say, in recent days, and I think it's probably because of our size. It's an Irish thing as opposed to a British thing. But I don't think many of us are taking the same level of personal delight in our misfortune. I think because of our society being more interconnected, I think even though she screwed up and even though she was obstinate and terrible and, did some wheeling, double dealing actually, you couldn't but feel sympathy for her as she comes to this stage. Whereas I'm just contrasting that. The numbers of them who are out on in the public arena, colleagues of hers, former colleagues of hers, and observers, and they're laughing about her having the sofa up against the door and so on. And I just find that kind of harsh and unnecessary. And I just think there's something tacky about it. There's something vulgar about it.
I heard someone on the radio describing her, even I just thought it was something like that. They described her as a goner. And I thought, again, it's just after, whatever, and it has been a ridiculous, such a calamity. But at the same time, it's
I found that
the human toll of it.
Well, the level of vulnerability she had, I saw her close up a few times. And I don't think she has huge empathy. I don't know if she has great emotional or political intelligence. But I don't think that she set out intentionally to cause this level of chaos. And I think she'll be badly broken by it, personally. I'd say it'll take her a long time to recover.
And is there any solution? Like, is Brexit not the cause of the chaos? Like, May will get the flack for, and the people will say the way she handled it was inept and she didn't make connections, and her own lack of kind of charm and all these things were factors. But is Brexit not the unsolvable puzzle, in that you look at it from a Northern Irish point of view, there is no solution to that? the economic cost for Britain, for Ireland, if there's a no deal especially. So whoever is in there, it isn't going to be any easier to solve.
Yeah, my worry about it is that it's a monster, that it's a virus. I think, we come from completely different places. Ireland was liberated by European Union membership. We stopped being the island behind the island.
Yeah.
We were equals around the table with the Brits. Our relationship was actually improved by it. They're an empire. They used to be a big world power. They had a very unhappy relationship with Europe down through the centuries. With the French, with the Spanish, with the Germans. 80% of books written about the Second World War are in English. The obsession with the Second World War, nasty Germans and so on, their antipathy towards the French, that often comes out. Whereas with us, for historic reasons, it's completely different. So this was coming. And I have huge sympathy with them for the pressures that are growing up in their society. You get all that tension when you go to England. You've overremarked there quite a bit. If I was taking a tube into work at 7:30 and coming home at 8 o'clock in the evening, and schools under pressure, infrastructure under pressure, I'd be angry. I'd want to kick someone, and I think the politicians are the people. And unfortunately, Brexit gave people that opportunity. But my worry about it is it's going to challenge what was a fragile but developing peace process. Like the killing stopped in Northern Ireland. That is a remarkable achievement in our lifetime. North-South relationships were in a good place. British-Irish relationships were in a good place. And maybe it's the pessimist in me, or the paranoid side to me, but I worry as well that the British don't realise how important and significant a unit they were in the European project. There's 65 million people. I saw how respected they were. Like, very basic example, the working language of the European Union switched from French to English, which is a really powerful influencing factor. Language, words. And I don't know if you've watched any of those behind-the-scenes documentaries, the most recent one on BBC 4 about Verhofstadt. And I was really, really concerned when I saw the level of uncertainty within the European institutions themselves about how to deal with this. And I am just wondering if the European Union itself, if it's not going to be significantly challenged and undermined by such a big unit leaving.
And then, because so much focus has been on Britain, we might have underestimated that effect at this stage.
Like, if there's a wall behind you with bricks there, and I think if you take 5 or 6 bricks out of that wall, it's a big, big loss. And the British have, they have great skills, and like just from a straightforward, selfish Irish point of view, because the Brits put their people doing the research on new measures that were coming through. A lot of the time, the Irish were cutting and pasting that. We were piggybacking on their expertise, and we were forming relationships with them. Now, okay, there's an opportunity for Ireland in that we're going to be the English speakers in there. You can see how the Americans will rate us even more with the British gone. But, you look around, say, the European capitals at the moment, and you say, who's going to be the person who's going to pick up the pieces here and come forward with the vision? Like, it's a long, long time since Europe had a Delors. And I don't see a Macron. You'd wonder whether Merkel might get a run at it. Maybe that time has passed. But I don't see the visionary. Like, I think part of the reason we had such chaos over the last few years in our own economies, in our own lives, is because the free marketeers, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Europe said, we won, they lost. And a lot of the old social cohesion that was there in Delors' time, that got lost. And I don't see any great ideologue or any great leader, any great charismatic figure coming along who will replace who will meet the challenge. And I'll put it to you this way: when Theresa May goes, and when a Brexiteer takes over, there's no solution there. But there's going to be a new team. You know, you won't have a Barnier, you won't have a Verhofstadt. Jean-Claude Juncker will be gone, and there's no ready-made A team to deal with these challenges.
One of the names you mentioned there in this series of unfortunate events, if you like, in this situation getting out of control was Martin McGuinness. Talk to me about him and your relationship with him and how you got to know
him. I knew him from my time in the Northwest. I worked in Derry for a while.
Yeah.
So I knew him when he was a significant force within what's called the Republican movement, but which in fact was the IRA.
Yeah.
And of course it was the time of Section 31 in RTE when we couldn't interview these people. And then when I came back in 2001, I got to know him a lot more. He had a brother who played for Sligo Rovers one time, Paul McGuinness, left full. Yeah.
Okay, well there you go.
Yeah.
That was your in.
Yeah, and like Derry is a small village.
Yeah.
Derry is like that, and I got to see McGuinness and Adams close up. I got to see all that chemistry, and I suppose McGuinness enjoyed interaction. McGuinness couldn't be cold.
Right.
I think long before the Good Friday Agreement, McGuinness knew that the way to achieve anything was not to be killing people.
Yeah.
And I think the way he applied himself, like McGuinness used to come up, he liked to sleep in his own bed, so he used to come up from Derry every morning and back at night. So he put in long shifts in politics. And I always felt about McGuinness that he was attempting to make up for the past, to make sure the past would never happen again by what he did in the present and the future. And I also thought that Paisley, in many respects, saw him as a son that he didn't have. That it was almost like a father and son relationship between them. Yeah. I remember once when they were over in the States, and I saw McGuinness taking Paisley's hand and linking him up the stairs. You know, I saw him, Paisley hadn't closed the fly in his trousers, and I saw him just gently, you know, helping out with that. And it was a very respectful thing. And Paisley used to call him, like, they had equal authority, First Minister and Deputy First Minister, they're equal roles. But Paisley used to refer to him as my deputy, as if he was the number two, or my gopher. And McGuinness went along with that all the time. And it was really, I talked to him when he was ill, and because I've some experience of dealing with cancer, we had some good chats about that, and I thought he was going to get better.
Did you?
I really did. I really, really did. And I thought it was really horrific and unfair and unfortunate that he didn't get a few more years. Like the chemotherapy was so hard on his system, it just took him away, and I feel he's a great loss. But I think even people who, and a lot of people hated what he stood for, but I think on a personal level, even many of his enemies saw that he was trying.
And when you say you talked with him about his illness, like, how did that conversation come about? Did he seek you out?
Well, we talk anyway.
Yeah.
But he went over to a hospital in London where he received treatment. Then he came back and he was receiving more. And on the New Year's Eve before he died, I just called up to see him, to see how he was getting on, and we talked about it that night too. And it looked like, that they were on top of things. Then he came. His last, I suppose, public appearance south of the border was a fantastic diplomat called Dermot Gallagher in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And he came down to that funeral. The thing about him, he appreciated the importance of funerals, McGuinness. He would always try to attend the funerals of people that he was connected to. And he came down to that funeral, and 2 or 3 days later he gave those interviews up in a hotel in Derry. And even that day I thought he was going to get better.
Did you?
Did. And then it was just terrible how quickly he died.
Did it upset you?
It saddened me deeply. You don't like seeing anybody die. But I felt he was very important to the peace process, and I thought he was doing his best. I thought it was really, really brave of Arlene Foster to go to his funeral. And I know lots of people tried to persuade her not to go. I know she was nervous about doing it. But I thought that was a really important gesture by her, and it was entirely genuine. And I'd say she misses him.
And you think the peace process in Northern Ireland misses him?
It does, because of, I suppose, the pivotal role he had. But, when we're talking about the peace process, you mentioned Seamus Mallon earlier. Like, the truth about the peace process is, it's the gospel according to Hume.
Yeah.
Hume was the man.
Yeah.
Hume is the man. Hume's values, spilling our sweat, not our blood. Hume's vision is the one that provided all the flooring for all those principles. They're all Hume values. Hume was an absolutely extraordinary person.
Yeah.
And Hume's formula was that that violence wasn't necessary, violence wasn't justified. And I think that's, like, there's not a day going by that, even say when they're arguing about this, that and the other, like, you nearly feel like punching the air that they're not killing each other.
Yeah.
Because we have lived through such. You're younger than me, but to think that there were people going to bed planning how they were going to kill their neighbour, and that was going on for 30 years in our country, and the impact it had in that society. It often strikes me as, when we talk about the North and the South, Dion, like, the way the South managed to compartmentalise the Civil War, and how neighbour killed neighbour and brother fought with brother and so on, and how quickly political structures were put in place and parties and arrangements. And the North hasn't managed to do that.
Why?
Possibly because of the orange-green factor. Possibly because, Fianna Fáil versus Fine Gael, I think it's a different thing, orange versus green. Possibly because the opposites are so different. But like in our own civil war, we did terrible things to each other. And I think it's remarkable that we didn't have people looking for investigations into this, or tribunals into that, or such a person held to account. And maybe that's why sometimes I feel that I'm drawn to the political class, that I think they get a bad press.
Right.
I think they have managed to work things out in a non-violent way.
Yeah. But this comes back to what I started with there as well, that they trust you. And Owen Harris said that your continuity, your presence there has made you this sort of beacon of trust in Northern Ireland. Like, are you, like, Are you a conduit for people at times? Do you find that is a role that has kind of come to you over the years?
No, I'm lucky, because RTE gives me the scope to say what I think.
Yeah.
It's not just report, but analysis has become, as they say, the industry has changed. That they give you that space.
But you couldn't do that job. You sitting here listening to you now, you couldn't do that job without providing that analysis. I don't think, could you?
Well,
as a person, as a journalist,
I suppose as I've got older, I consider these the grace note years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not wondering are they going to sack me. I'm not wondering is the ceiling going to fall in. I'm at that stage in my life where if you believe something, you should say it, or you should try and explain it.
Yeah.
And I also feel that, Christ, if you're not fair to people, or you don't try to be fair to people, like I love when people trust you to give you an interview or an exclusive. I love, say, for instance, that if you ring somebody up with 10 minutes to go, that they'll come on the air or whatever for a programme. And like from an RTE perspective, like people pay license fees, there are shareholders. What the hell is the point in having somebody up in Northern Ireland if you don't try and give people a sense of what's going on, and you don't try and give them an inside track, and you don't try and give them an assessment, because like we're in the business to explain and communicate, and I suppose that's part of your role. And if there's no point in being understood by, or trying to be understood by, a small segment of the population. Generally in RTE, people would say, Jesus, if it's Northern Ireland, they'll switch channels. And I just don't accept that.
Right.
I think you have you've got to get into that space where people understand why it's important to them. And that's the godsend of Brexit, that we all realise it's important. Like everyone could do a PhD in Brexit.
But you can give that, like that is a position that maybe other reporters, for whatever reason, wouldn't feel confident. They might sit here or go on the news and say, well, that was the decision of the British people when they're talking about Brexit. I've heard you talk about, like, when you're talking about Northern Ireland and Brexit, you've talked about, like, say, the bad actors in certain situations, like the Tory party, the DUP. You've also mentioned Sinn Féin and their policy of abstentionism in that context. Like, these are things that other people might feel, I can't, venture an opinion on these.
Well, maybe a thing that has encouraged me in doing that as well is, at a time when our industry is changing and when, is television an old medium, it's almost like this little present has dropped. And the present is the website. And the website allows you to write. And some of my most satisfying work in the last 2 years has come from writing. And in writing, the gloves are off. You don't need the pictures. You can tell it as you see it. And I'm finding that's just a positive. That's an energizing force in my work these times. And you can have opinions, and you can bring in, past observations into pieces like that. So I like that.
Talk to me about the Grace Note years, as you put them. Like, you've referred to the precarious business of survival in the past. Like, how are you, and like, how much of your headspace does your illness take? Do you consider yourself as having an illness?
I find it probably the most liberating force or factor. Because it's the thing we all run away from. The fact that none of us gets out of here alive. The fact that we're all going to die. And I've beaten the rap in many respects. I was diagnosed in 1994 through a series of lucky breaks. I got myself to Sweden.
Yeah.
And I was able to use journalism to sort of help me in that journey. As I was able to make a program about it, which I found very interesting, to explain how you access healthcare. And, you know, you didn't feel you were going for surgery, you felt you were going to do a job. I've been lucky as a black cat since. My disease is called neuroendocrine tumours. So they're hormone-producing tumours. It's the same disease that Steve Jobs had, that Aretha Franklin had. Nick Robinson, the BBC presenter, had a tumour removed in his thoracic area, I think, or on his lung maybe. It's amazing to be still alive. I've had lots of things done to me. I've liver secondary since 1994. I get an injection every 28 days. I came close to the edge a few times. And
did you?
I did, yeah. It's not a pretend disease. It's real.
Yeah.
I've had, I've been so lucky that just when I needed something, I got it at the right time or in the right place. So I've been, we've a national centre now in St. Vincent's, and we're setting up this Irish version of the Swedish model. But look, the amazing thing about it for me is my son is 22, my daughter is 26, and I've been around for them.
And your son wasn't born when you were diagnosed?
No. Maya's 26. She was 9 months, so Joe wasn't born. So my wife has been absolutely remarkable. She has done the rearing, and she's been the warmth in the relationship. I've been like value added, an occasional presence, in many ways deliberately, because there was a right good chance that I wouldn't be around forever. But to have got to this stage, this is bonus time.
Yeah.
Absolute bonus time. And if I walked out the door here in Fumbley Lane and a bus ran over me, I'd shake hands and say I had a good innings. I'd be delighted, that I was given so long.
And were you at peace with it from the beginning, or is that something that's come over time? Because I've seen I've had, family members with different types of cancer, and it affects people differently. In that sense, in the mental sense as much as anything.
I'm a useless Catholic, in that I prayed and I asked for a dig out from Paddy the plasterer in heaven. And I just asked for a bit of time. And I just feel really thankful I've been given that. And I have no fear about it whatsoever.
Do you not?
No fear about mortality. Like, I knew your father, and he was a really good man, and I know how much he loved you, and I know how much you loved him, and that stays with you. And when I look at what has happened to others, I've been, 3 years ago, we were getting ready to go to the last Spurs match in White Hart Lane. It was a present for my 60th birthday. I was going with Joe, and the phone rang, and my sister was dead.
Yeah.
And she was younger than me. And if I could have done a deal to swap places, I'd gladly have done it, because she deserved more time. So I've seen how the earthquake can come, and how lives are absolutely turned head over heels. Lives are taken. So in my case, I've won.
Yeah.
And I'm really thankful for that. So maybe that's why in the last, I'd be 65 in April 2021, and I'd like to stay working with RT until the last day. I have to retire then. But I'm owed absolutely nothing. I've been lucky. And it, for many people a lot more talented than me and a lot better than me, they don't have the same luck.
Talk to me about Tottenham Hotspur then. Tell me about the Champions League semi-final against Ajax and how you'd given up.
Yeah, I love Spurs almost as much as I love Sligo Rovers. There was a house in our road in Sligo. McIntyre's had the first television, and we saw the Danny Blanchflower penalty. It was against Burnley, Adam Blacklaw, when I was 4 or 5, and we were Spurs from then on. And of course, they're a great team then, and I've followed them since. Because of that story I told you, when we were going to head to the last match, I'm sort of, it's a sensitive, fragile enough relationship say this year. So, like, I didn't expect it. I didn't expect to beat Manchester City. So that night, the choice was watch the match or collect my daughter from the airport. So I was happier to collect Moya and chat on the way down. I was getting all these texts about the match. So when I got home to Sligo, we watched the match until 2 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't believe it. So then they're playing against Ajax in the semi-final. And again, it was the day of the British-Irish Intergovernmental meeting in the Cabinet Office in London. So again, I say, now maybe if you stay away, something might happen here, or if you're watching it and they get hockeyed, you'll just be fed up. So work was the liberator, really, the distraction. So I watched the first 2 goals for Ajax on the Stansted Express. I got to the airport, Stansted, and I watched, couldn't believe it, Spurs get 2 back. And just as we were boarding the plane, Vertonghen's one that nearly went in was taken from under. So I said, that's it, it's over. So I was sitting beside a retired principal from Carrickfergus. He was telling me, there's a good journalist in BBC, a young girl called Jane McCormack, and he was telling me he taught her. And he was a bit of a Spurs fan. So we were about 10 minutes out of Aldergrove. And the next thing, my phone went on fire. And the first message was from COYS, come on you Spurs, Peter Robinson. He's a mad Spurs supporter. Absolutely, mental Spurs supporter. He was, for his 70th birthday, he was given a present of, a match in the new stadium.
Right.
And he was like a child going to that. So anyway, he was the first one, and I just couldn't believe it. And I was sitting beside this man who's, I suppose, late 60s, early 70s, and I started singing on the plane, come on you Spurs! So anyway, so that was the miracle of Spurs.
Yeah.
So no, I won't go to the final.
You won't go to the final?
Definitely not.
Will you watch it?
Oh yeah, I'll watch it with Joe. And
Right.
I expect Liverpool to win. And I think Liverpool have been brilliant for football, and I think they're a great club, and I wouldn't begrudge it to them. If they win, so be it. But I think Pochettino has done remarkable work for Spurs.
He's a great manager.
He's an amazing guy.
Yeah, he is.
I loved that story, that book about him, how this guy, I think it's the guy who's managing Leeds.
Bielsa, yeah.
So he went to look at, do you know the story?
Yeah.
He went to look at Pochettino, and he wasn't playing in this match.
Yeah.
So he lived a few miles away, and Pochettino was in bed. And he goes into the house, and the parents say he's asleep, and he goes in and he just wants to look at his legs. And he could tell if he was a good footballer by his legs. So, they're special people.
So they are special people. How do you look back on the Roy Keane interview?
With regret.
Really?
Yeah. I think it was there for Ireland. I think Keane wanted to play, I don't think Mick McCarthy is a bad man. And I think the messing that we're seeing in the FAI, that it was there then.
Yeah.
You know, the Blazers and their families in the front of the plane, the journalists brought along to subsidise it, and the players on the same flight feeling that they were show ponies.
Yeah.
And I think that's what drove Keane mad. And that was 2001.
Yeah.
So, you know, 17, 18 years of it we've had. Keane he's an amazing talent. He's complex, really, really complex. I wouldn't like to get on his wrong side. But like when you think of how far we travelled in that World Cup, if he had been there, I think, you know, we could have.
So you mean you look back on the whole? I thought you meant you look back on the interview itself with regret.
No.
Just the.
No, the interview was sort of luck in that, you know, the old story, if you hang around long enough while the others, like the apostles, fall asleep, you know, we just stayed and just kept rooting and got it. But no, it was... but
did you think there was a chance when you were doing it that this could be...
I thought
this would be the propeller to get him back?
Oh, yeah. And I think Keane stayed up, Keane stayed up watching, you know, the reaction to it.
Did he?
Oh, yeah. Like Keane, there was a side of Keane that wanted it.
Yeah,
Keane is a winner. He wanted to play for Ireland, but he wanted to play in the right circumstances. But I suppose I learned something about our own business around that time as well. There was a lot of stuff, you know, this 24-hour news cycle that was beginning to kick in then. And there was all this nonsense. Roy Keane may apologise.
Yeah.
Roy Keane expected to apologise. Roy Keane hasn't apologised. And it was sort of people looking to second guess and third guess and whatever. And that journalism sometimes can have a mischievous role and a negative role in things.
But there was a lot of giddiness as well, and there was a time difference, which I think...
Yeah.
And I remember, because I was in Isimo that week when you had the interview, and you look back at it now, a bunch of us, all the journalists, huddled around a phone.
Listening.
And that somebody then rang home and put the phone up to the television.
Yeah.
And that's how we listened to the interview. And we were expecting, and everyone was briefed, or expecting it to be the apology. And I remember the moment, the minute he said that he called the players cowards.
Yes.
And there was this sort of in this room, and everyone wanted it to happen.
Yes.
That was the thing, or most people did. And the room just kind of went, "This is going to be a tough. This is going to be a tough sell now."
Yes.
And then we traipsed off to the hotel and woke Mick McCarthy up to get his reaction. But there were so many layers, and filters between the Keane interview and what and Mick wanted him to come back. If the if Keane had just come out and done something that wasn't very Keane like. Yeah,
but Keane, I noticed this in the northern stuff as well. Nuance is what's important. It's the nuance that you got to watch for. The nuance tells the story. There's absolutely no way Roy Keane was going to, and it was because, you know, guys who didn't have the story and weren't going to get the story and were winding it up in a simplistic kind of a way. Like they were setting up the accident, guaranteeing it to happen. But I know, and I'll go to my grave believing, that Keane wanted to go back. You know that Mick McCarthy wanted him to go back because they would have had a better chance. And I'd say if people had their lives over again, the row wouldn't have happened. But maybe the important point I'm trying to make is the circumstances that created that tension within the Irish camp were there in the structure of Irish football at the time. And 17, 18 years later, that sort of incompetence is still there.
We started with football and we'll end with football. Tommie, that's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. It flew.
Good. Well, that was really moving listening to Tommie Gorman speak about his own illness and the people and politicians he's encountered in his life. Don't forget, before we go, to subscribe to Ireland Unfiltered on all the usual channels. And if you like the show, please leave a review. We'll see you next time.